Welcome, welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And
Amen.
move right
Amen.
into thank you. And hopefully you can see the screen share at this point. And of course, we are still in this conversation where God is commissioning Moses to go to speak to Pharaoh, and of course, ultimately to lead the Israelites out of slavery and out of Egypt to the land of Israel. And Moses, of course, is overwhelmed by this thought of having to do this, and he's resisting. He is, as you'll see, he resists a large number of times, and so we're going to go on. So God is trying to reassure him that he is going to be successful in this mission. Right? This is God speaking here. Va'ani, and as for me, Yadati, I know, ki lo yiten etchem melech Mitzrayim lahaloch. I know already that the king of Egypt is not going to give you permission. He's not going to allow you to leave. V'lo b'yad chazaka. So, and this phrase here, Rashi's going to play around with, and it sounds like unless it's with a strong hand, right? Literally, it just simply means and not with a strong hand. So this is ambiguous, and I think Rashi is going to try and explain the ambiguity to us. We'll take a look and see how he handles it. So, but it's interesting, right, that at this moment, right before he actually sets foot to do this, and he hasn't agreed yet, that God is telling him it isn't going to be easy, right? It isn't. Pharaoh is going to resist this particular idea of letting the Israelites go free. Okay, so here we go. Let's see if we can find it. The Rashi is actually on this page, I believe. Here it is. Lo yiten etchem melech Mitzrayim lahaloch. The king of Egypt is not going to allow you to go. Im ein ani mareh lo yadi hachazaka. Unless I show him my strong hand. Klomar, that is to say, Kol od she'ein ani modi'i yadi hachazaka, that as long as I don't demonstrate to him, right, let him know my power, that my strong arm, right? So again, understand that the word arm implies strength. Hand, that's the word yad, right, implies the ability to do something, to actually accomplish something. So because our hand is our part of our anatomy that manipulates so much of reality around us and causes things. So hand in general, right, as a metaphor, refers to the ability to accomplish tasks. Lo yiten etchem lahaloch. He's not going to allow you to go. He's not going to let you go. Lo yiten. So he will not give, literally. The word natan generally means to give, right? So it is, in fact, a little bit strange in this particular situation, right? And he says, lo yishbok, right? And I think that's more of an Aramaism. He is not going to allow you. He's not going to release you. No, he's not going to release you. That's Jastro in there. And he says, give some examples. Rashi gives some examples. Kamor, in Genesis chapter 20, where Avimelech, remember, Abraham and Sarah go into the Philistine territory, and Avimelech takes Sarah, and God appears to Avimelech, right, and tells him what's going on, because Avimelech and his wives are afflicted. They're afflicted by an inability, some sorts of plague, right? And it says, Ki alken lo nataticha. God says to Avimelech, because Sarah is actually Abraham's wife, that's the reason I did not release you. I did not allow you here. And then again in Genesis chapter 31, Lo nitano Elohim lahara imadi. And this is Jacob telling his wives, I believe that Laban, their father, was not given, not allowed, not released to do evil to him. And they all use this expression of giving. V'yesh mefarshin, there are those who explain, v'lo b'yad chazaka, right, and not with a strong hand, v'lo bishvil sheyado chazaka, right? So this is interesting. I think this is referring now to Pharaoh, right? And v'lo bishvil means, and not on account of or for the sake of, or something like that. The word bishvil means for the sake of, something like that, right? Or because. Shiado chazaka, that his arm is strong. Ki me'az eshalach et yadi, because once I send my hand, this is God, of course, speaking, from the moment that I send my hand, v'hiketi et Mitzrayim, and I strike Egypt, etc., etc. Umetargeminan oto velo min kodam. This is interesting. Mo kodam dechile takif. So Rashi seems to be saying here that this is following the Targum, which is oto, him, velo min kadom dechile takif, and not because his power is strong, which is I'm struggling honestly to really fully comprehend what the point is here. Okay. And he simply, Rashi is now giving his reference, Mishmo shel Rabbi Yaakov bar Rabbi Menachem Ne'amarli. So he's giving the source of where he learned this particular interpretation. So, so Dechile, his power would have to be, I believe, referring to Pharaoh, right? So, exactly. Unless what he's saying is that the reason why God is going to have to smite those Egyptians is because of Pharaoh's power that is so strong that he has to overcome it, that possibly that is the idea of going on here. But hopefully this is one of those situations where I don't fully understand what the point is, and maybe someone who's watching this has a better sense of this, and please feel free to let me know. You can put it in your comments to me if you happen to understand it, or if any of you who are listening now have a sense of this. It is interesting. Going on. I'm going to go on. Okay, let's see. All right. V'shalachti et yadi, I will send forth my hand, literally, right? And here he goes. The Targum says, Gavurti, my power, right? Let's see. I'm just looking quickly, glancing at the Targum here. Okay. I'm going to give this another shot. I'm going to go back and give another shot to this. That the way he's saying is that velo min kodam dechele takif. And I'm putting a comma here and not before. In other words, he's not going to let you go before. And this actually fits in fairly comfortably. Dechele, because his power is strong. In other words, because Pharaoh is so powerful, he is not going to let you go until I, God, overcome him. So that actually does make sense to me, and I am pretty comfortable that that is what it is. And look how important a comma is, because there's no comma in the Rashi, but there's no comma here either. But because I'm seeing it more in the context of the Targum, I think that is. Lo min kodam, meaning not before. Dechelek takiv, because his power is strong. And so the Lord.
What about the trope?
Oh, and so there's a tipcha here, which is a pause, right? Velo b'yad chazaka. I mean, it's still difficult. The Hebrew still isn't easy to translate that, but and not b'yad chazaka means with a strong hand, right? So that first interpretation of Rashi's, which is he's not going to let you go except unless I, smite him and act in a powerful kind of way, overpower him. It's meaning almost the same thing, but it's a different nuance, right? So the velo here means and not beforehand. Dechele takif, because biyad chazakah, here we're understanding biyad chazakah in a sense, meaning his power is so strong, God is going to have to overpower him. But I honestly think I'm giving you a good interpretation here based on the Targum. So I'm going to keep going. V'shalachti et yadi, I will stretch forth my hand, v'hiketi et Mitzrayim, and I will smite Egypt, b'chol neflootai, with all my wonders, asher eseh b'kibor, which I will perform in his midst, v'acharei chen, and after that, yishalach etchem, he will then send you. So again, God is forewarning Moses. He's telling him ahead of time that this is all going to have to transpire, which obviously is a help because you're going to see, right? It's not going to happen easily. And by the end of this Parsha, we're going to see something interesting. I'm not going to tell you any more than that right now in the hopes that we maybe get to the end of this Parsha. We may not this year, I'm sorry to say, but regardless, it's interesting. Going on. V'natati et chen ha'am hazeh be'enei Mitzrayim. And I shall place the grace of this people, in other words, the Israelites, be'enei Mitzrayim, in the sight of Egypt. And we're going to explain exactly what this means. V'haya ki telechun, and it shall be that when you depart, lo telchu rekam, you will not depart empty-handed. They're going to get paid for their servitude. They're not going to have been enslaved and done all their work for nothing. So I think that's the point that God is making to Moses at this point, right? It's going to be he's laying out for him the whole map ahead. And how's this going to happen? V'sha'ala isha mishchenta, and a woman will request of her neighbor, umigarat beta, or from the person living in her house, clay kesef, vessels of silver, uchlei zahav, and vessels of gold, usmalot, and clothing. V'samtem al b'nechem, you shall place them on your children, v'al b'notechem, that is on your sons and on your daughters, v'nitzaltem it Mitzrayim, and you will strip Egypt. So right now, of course, they're in exactly the opposite situation. And so God is telling Moses, there's going to be a 180-degree turnaround ultimately at the end of this. Umigerat beta, let me make sure I've got the migarat beta, sorry. And he says, me'ota shehi gara ita babayit. In other words, there were Egyptian families or Egyptian women who were living alongside in the homes of the Israelites. So that's the Garat Beta. Venitzaltem, right? Ketargumo. He says it is, as the Targum translates, Venitzaltem, Utero Kanun. Make sure again that I'm pronouncing this correctly. So it's Torokinun, right? Which means essentially you will empty out, you'll strip Yat Mitzrayim, Egypt. V'chein, and he says likewise, we have similar expressions in Exodus chapter 12, Vayinatzlu et Mitzrayim. So this again is talking about how they were going to strip the Egyptians. Right, so there's the Vayinatzlu and the Vinatzaltem, right? Nitzaltem. And again, Vayit Natzlu Bnei Yisrael et Edyam. So essentially it's got to do with removing, right, the children of Israel, their ornaments. Here it has to do with after the sin of the golden calf, the Israelites, in terms of trying to show repentance, removed the ornaments that they had been wearing up to that point, out of a sense, I imagine, of shame and regret, etc. V'hanun bo yesod. And he says the letter nun in this v'natzal, right, v'nitzlu, is actually part of the root of the letter of the word. Umenachem chibro. However, one of Rashi's sources, Menachem, I think it's Menachem ben Saruk, chibro, he interprets it b'machberet as in his work, in his interpretation, an earlier interpretation of the Torah that Rashi makes reference to from time, um, at times, Sadi, right? And he does not include the nun, right? Im Bereshit. So here we go. He uses this Vayitzal Elohim et mikne avechim, and here it says, and God removed the cattle of your fathers, or of your father. Again, I believe this is Jacob talking to his wives as to how he finally winds up with some of the best of Laban's flock. Okay. Asher hitzil Elohim me avinu, right? So again, which God removed from our fathers. Velo ye'amnun divarav, and he says he does not agree with Menachem. He says he cannot prove what he is saying. In other words, what these examples that he gives does not prove it. Okay. So, I think when it says b'machberet sadi back here, it sounds to me like Menachem puts, in other words, to the extent that Menachem possibly has a dictionary of some kind, that instead of putting it under the nun as natsal, he puts the word under the tzaddik, right? As if the first letter of the word of is actually a tzaddik and not the nun. And I think that's the point that Rashi's saying, is that he should have, Menachem, according to Rashi, should have located this word natsal under nun, and not as if the nun is simply a service letter. Ki im lo haita hanun yesod. Rashi goes on to say, because if the nun were not actually part of the root, vehi nikuda bechirik, okay, and the nun at this point would have had a chirik, an e sound underneath it, lo tahe meshameshet belashon ufaltem. It would not have, okay, so v'nitzaltem, right? V'nitzaltem, let's find it. Here it is, nitzaltem, right? There it is, right? He's saying that if the nun were not part of the root of the letter, and it was set up as me, and that it was really tzala or something like that, it would mean you will be. It would mean it would have to do with the passive voice, right? There's a construction in Hebrew called nif'al. You hear the n in nif'al, and it is the passive of the active voice. And he's saying, if in fact v'nitzaltem had meant to be understood in a passive sense, right? It would not be active. V'lashon ufaltem. That is in the sense of active. Ela bashon v'nif'altem. But it would have to be understood in a passive sense. Kamor, and he gives an example, v'nisachtem me'al ha'adama, where it means, and again, and you will be plucked. Notice the passivity of that, and that's because the nun here is not part of the root. It's simply, it is in this case, a letter that's being used in a utility kind of way to create a grammatical construction. And probably the root here is sacha, samachet he, me'al hama. You will be plucked off the earth. Another example, v'nitatem b'yad oyev, where it means you will be given over into the power of your enemy. Again, passive voice. V'nigaftem, and you will be destroyed, lifnei oyvechem, before your enemies. So he's saying that the nun has to be part of this word for it to be understood actively. Again, he gives another example, the nitachtem, right? And I believe, again, the roots here are tacha, right? And probably, I think it would be gafa, right? That would be the root of the letter, right? So, minitachtem vetocha, you will be melted into it. Jeremiah, V'amarten nitzalnu, right? And you shall say, we are saved. Again, always, these are all passive, right? Lashon nif'alnu. It has the meaning of, it is done to us. It's passive. V'chein kol nun, and he says, every nun, shehi ba'a bateva lifrakim, right? And it applies to any word that comes in a word, lifrakim, at times, v'nofelet mimeno, right? So I could be that I am wrong here, and forgive me because I did go over this, but he says in a case of a word where the nun is something that at times becomes elided, mimenu, kenun shel nogef, nose, noten, right? So he gives examples of verbs that start with a nun. They would be called pei nun verbs, right? Nogef, to destroy, noseh, to carry, noten, to give, noshech would be to bite. Keshehi medaberet lashon ufaltem, that when it is understood in a active sense, tinaked b'shava, it gets pointed with a shava, bechataf, and again, I believe, let's take a look. Yes. Okay. So I think the chataf again is the understanding of a shava. Kagon, for example, he gives in Genesis 45, unisatem et oivechem. You will carry your avichem. You will bear your father. And this, of course, is talking about carrying Jacob. But you see, it's not Venisa, it's unisatem et avichem. Example, unitatem lahem et eretz hagilgal, and you will give them the land of Gilad. Again, active. Unimaltem et basar orlatchem, and you shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskins. Lachen ani omer, and for this reason, he says, shezot hanekuda bechirik, right? That the fact that here in this letter, right, here it's pointed with a chirik min hayisodhu. It has to be understood as part of the root of the letter itself, right? It's not being okay. So I think the point he's making, and forgive me for taking so long to explain this, but the point that he's making is that in this particular case, the nun at the beginning is not being understood in that utility sense of creating a passive voice, but is pointed with an e and not with a shava, because it is to be understood in an active sense, and it's not to be understood in a passive way. Vahu looks Hayesod hu, the Yesod Shem Davar, right? And the root is a noun, it seems. Shem Davar is usually a noun. Okay. So I think he's saying, and that when you're using this root as a noun, right? Nitzu, Vahu, and so that is, so in other words, as a noun, it would mean saved, saved. Vahu min halashonot, and this is an example of expressions, hakvedim, that he's saying, hakvedim generally means it's got to do with a construction in Hebrew called PL, right? So we have 7 constructions in Hebrew of verbs that connote different things, and the PL is like it's more of an emphatic expression. It's using a verb in an emphatic kind of way, but even explaining it that way isn't so clear. So he says, kamo dibor, so speech, kippur, I'm going to think means atonement, limud, learning, Kesheyidabru b'lashon, when these words are used b'lashon ufaltem in an active sense, so it says yinaked b'chirik. They are all pointed with this chirik, and in fact, this construction is called the PL. You can hear the E of PL, right? It's so they are pointed with a chirik, kamo the dibartem. So you said D. Notice the E under dibartem. You shall speak el hasela. You shall speak to the rock. And in Ezekiel 45, v'kiparten et habayit, and you shall cleanse, make atonement, something like that. The temple is what it's, or yeah, I think that's what they're referring to. And in Deuteronomy 11, v'limadatem otam et benechem, that's from the Shema, right? And you shall teach them to your children. So as I said, there's more of an emphatic sense when limadatem, right? That you shall teach them diligently, right? You've heard, some of you have seen that translation, and that's the way to state the emphatic element of it. Yes, Lauren.
Um, every example they used of the passive
Yes,
was related to destruction or salvation.
yes.
I think that was all things that had to come from God.
Mm.
And these examples are all things that we can do or should do.
Yeah. Okay. It's something I'm going to have to think about. That's a very interesting observation. You know, that you saw that you caught that sense there. It could well be. I of course I was so focused on just trying to understand the grammar and to try and explain the grammar involved here. And you know, Rashi, we know that Rashi does this from time to time. That not only does he explain the flow of the story or the narrative or the law, but there are times when he actually gets into issues of grammar, and of course we've just had a major excursus on a grammatical point here. So yeah, but it's interesting what you're saying. I'd have to go back and reflect on what you just said. So I appreciate very much your observation about this. So we have used up all our time in this in this grammatical explanation. Rashi took a long time to discuss this, and frankly, of course, we are just starting chapter 4. So we'll pick this up with God's help tomorrow. And let me just get the place here. Okay, okay. And, so that God willing, we will do this, start this tomorrow. All right, and I'm going to stop the share, and this is it for this morning. Thank you.